Hong Kong. The Chinese government and its allies in Hong Kong on Tuesday denounced a group of protesters who had stormed the legislature a day ago, leading a barrage of criticism that gave the city's embattled leader a moment of reprieve. Dozens of protesters had charged and occupied Hong Kong's legislative office building on Monday, breaking glass walls and spray-painting surfaces with slogans on the politically significant anniversary of Hong Kong's return to China from Britain. On Tuesday, China's leadership sent a strongly worded warning to the semi-autonomous territory, accusing those protesters of being an extreme radical who committed an illegal act that tramples on the rule of law and jeopardizes social order. The decision by some protesters to resort to destructive tactics has momentarily deflected scrutiny and criticism away from Carrie Lam, Hong Kong's embattled chief executive, and her handling of a contentious bill that triggered some of the largest demonstrations the territory has seen. But it also raised questions about the effectiveness and political prospects of Mrs. Lam, who was handpicked by China. Mrs. Lam, whom protesters have urged to resign, told her top advisors in a closed-door meeting at her official residence on Tuesday that she intended to serve out her term of office through 2022, said Regina Ip, a pro-Beijing lawmaker and a member of the Executive Council who was in the meeting. But her advisors responded bluntly that she needs to work on her handling of Hong Kong's escalating unrest. We all advised her to improve her communication strategy, said Regina Ip, a pro-Beijing lawmaker and a member of the Executive Council with whom Mrs. Lam met. As protests have rocked the city, Mrs. Lam has said several times that she would work harder at reaching out to groups with different political views, but has yet to do so. For weeks, Mrs. Lam has appeared unable to quell swelling anger as citizens voiced their discontent with the political leadership in Hong Kong, a former British colony that was handed back to China in 1997. The protests began as opposition to a bill Mrs. Lam was pushing that would allow China to extradite Hong Kong citizens. But they quickly morphed into a broader expression of anxiety over China's encroachment into the territory and the erosion of the civil liberties that set it apart from the rest of China. While hundreds of thousands of people marched peacefully to demand Mrs. Lam's resignation on Monday, a core group of other, mostly younger, demonstrators stormed the legislature. For hours, the police, who had been accused of excessive force in earlier protests, largely stood by, and they made a surprise retreat once the protesters began to breach an inner door. Some questioned why Mrs. Lam did not urge the police to step in sooner. Why did she let the people get into the Legislative Council, said Jean-Pierre Cabestan, a political scientist at Hong Kong Baptist University. In what country is the parliament not protected by the police? Most leading voices in Hong Kong's pro-Beijing camp, who hold a majority in the legislature, echoed the Chinese government in condemning the violence. This is an insult to the Legislative Council, and an insult to Hong Kong's rule of law, said Starry Lee, a pro-establishment lawmaker of the Democratic Alliance for the Betterment and Progress of Hong Kong, who called on the government to investigate and bring charges in order to send a message that those who break the law need to be punished. Other pro-Beijing lawmakers, business groups and the Law Society, a typically pro-establishment group of lawyers that had earlier called for the government to delay passage of the contentious bill, added their voices to the drumbeat of criticism against the demonstrators. Opposition lawmakers were more sympathetic to the protesters, saying that they had resorted to violence out of desperation over not being heard. Surprisingly, a few lawmakers from the pro-Beijing camp said the government ought to accept some blame for the mayhem. James Tien, the honorary chairman of the pro-establishment Liberal Party, said that by ordering the police to stand back, the government was deliberately letting the students make a fool of themselves. That seems like they were encouraging these violent acts, he said. Some of the city's pro-Beijing business elite who have come to depend on China for their success also began to ask whether it was time to revive discussions about political reform that would address concerns from protesters about their sense of powerlessness in politics. So many people are complaining about the unfairness of the political arrangement right now, said Felix Chung, a lawmaker who represents the textiles and garment sector. Mr. Chung was referring broadly to a system in which Beijing effectively has the most say over who becomes the territorial's leader, and only half the seats in the legislature are filled by popular elections. I don't mind political reform, he said. Michael Tian, another pro-Beijing lawmaker and retail magnate, went further. I am pleading for the chief executive to speak to Beijing to introduce constitutional reform, he said, referring to a proposal made by Beijing in 2015 to allow residents to elect the chief executive from a slate of candidates approved by a committee under its control. To me, this is another case of young people getting frustrated and yearning to have their voices heard, he said. It's unclear if China's President, Xi Jinping, would even entertain such a proposal. The authoritarian leader has emphasized the importance of maintaining the integrity of China's territory and sought to expand Beijing's influence in Hong Kong. The mainland Chinese news media, which is tightly controlled by the ruling Communist Party, has provided little reporting on the protests that have roiled Hong Kong for the past several weeks and thrown the city's leadership into a political crisis. But on Tuesday, Chinese government's statements criticizing the protests received blanket coverage across major Chinese state media outlets, alongside editorials that blamed the unrest on hostile Western forces bent on fomenting a revolution in the territory. The protesters were portrayed as hooligans motivated by mob violence, with state-run outlets omitting details of their broader political demands. Out of blind arrogance and rage, protesters showed a complete disregard for law and order, said an editorial in the Global Times, a nationalist tabloid. By limiting discussion of the protests, the government was obscuring a potential embarrassment to the party and Mr. Xi. The government also might be eager to prevent outbursts of nationalism, which can be seen as a challenge to party's primacy, analysts said. The party always wants to stay ahead of Chinese nationalism, said Dan Lynch, a professor of Asian and International Studies at the City University of Hong Kong. The protests were a test of the Communist Party's patience with Hong Kong, said Kerry Brown, a professor of Chinese politics at King's College London. They think, we've allowed these people all these kinds of privileges and freedoms, and look at the way they behave, he said. It will just reinforce the narrative that this is a spoiled kind of place. With other pressing matters like a trade dispute with the United States and a slowing economy, however, Professor Brown said that Mr. Xi was likely to take a conservative approach, unless the unrest begins to inflict damage on Hong Kong's economy. Hong Kong lives and dies on its prowess as a financial center, he said.